So what exactly happens when you don't have an oral tradition? Let's discuss this, but first let's recap some of the things we've already spoken about. We've spoken about the fact that you can't even read the Bible without the oral tradition of the Jewish people, because the vowels, which tell us what each word actually means, was only handed down orally. We've also spoken about the fact that it's impossible to fulfill the commandments without the details that the oral tradition provides. Moreover, we've also spoken about the fact that the prophets very clearly kept the oral tradition, and they spoke against the people as not following the commands of God when the people didn't follow the oral tradition. And yet, there were groups of people throughout history who broke away from the oral tradition of the Jewish people and rejected it entirely, creating their own splinter groups. Groups such as the Sadducees. The Sadducees rejected the Oral Torah. And because they rejected the Oral Torah, they had to come up with their own way of interpreting the text. They tried to go according to a hyper-literal meaning of the text, but because that's absolutely impossible, it meant that they were not able to correctly fulfill the commandments. You see, when you don't have the Oral Torah, when you don't have the instructions of how to fulfill the commandments, you can end up completely divergent. Let me give you a couple examples of how the Sadducees differed from the Pharisaic or Orthodox Jews. There's a commandment not to kindle a light in your dwelling on the Sabbath day. According to the Pharisees or the Orthodox Jews, this means we don't actually kindle a light on Sabbath. We are allowed to benefit from fire or from electricity that was already kindled before Sabbath began. For instance, we're allowed to use a crock pot, or we're allowed to use a hot plate. We're allowed to use electricity that was already turned on. However, we're not allowed to just go around flicking on lights, as that would be kindling a new light on Sabbath. That would be forbidden. The Sadducees, on the other hand, believed that any type of fire that was running on the Sabbath day was completely forbidden to use. Therefore, they sat in their house in the dark and they ate cold food on the Sabbath day. That's just one of the many differences. Here's one more big difference that made a major impact on people's lives. Surely you've read inside the Bible the famous phrase, an eye for an eye. According to the Sadducees, this was to be taken literally. If one person put out another's eye, then he would have his eye taken out. That would be considered the appropriate punishment. However, the Pharisaic Jews, the Orthodox Jews, those who have the Oral Torah, have never interpreted this verse that way. According to the oral tradition, if somebody's eye is harmed by somebody else, that person is supposed to pay them the monetary value of an eye as recompense. What does that mean? That means that the rabbinical court takes into account the emotional pain, the physical pain, the loss of income, the generation in which they're living, all these different variables to determine an appropriate monetary value for the eye. It's a living law, and that's why we need judges. They need to be able to give us the right formula to reach the right ruling for every situation. Let me give you one example of why the Sadducee interpretation could not be correct. What happens if a blind person who's missing his eyeball was to damage the eye of somebody else? How could he be punished? If he didn't have an eye, then how could you go and take his eye? Clearly, that cannot be what the Torah intended. We have to have an oral tradition in order to correctly fulfill the commandments. Now, here is something super important, so pay attention. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 9, God informs us that He has a covenant with us, a promise to protect us, to keep us, to never let us fade away, and that covenant is dependent upon properly fulfilling the commandments. Let me read the verse to you. You must know that Hashem your God, He is the God, the faithful God, who safeguards the covenant and the kindness for those who love Him and for those who observe His commandments for 1,000 generations. God promises that the Jewish people will remain intact if they keep His commandments. Now, what's really interesting is if we stop and we look at all the groups that rejected the Oral Torah, who observe the commandments differently than the Orthodox Jews, than the Pharisees, we have to ask the question, where did they disappear to? There are no more Sadducees. There are no more Essenes. There are no more Nazarenes. There are no more descendants of Paul. There are no early Jewish Christians. But there are Pharisees. There are Orthodox Jews. You see, it is the Pharisees, the Orthodox Jews, those who have always upheld the oral tradition as given to Moses, that have the covenantal promise that they will never be destroyed. Despite the many people who have risen up to destroy us, the core group of the Jewish people, the Orthodox Jews who observe the Torah, have never faded away. And we will never fade away, because we are the recipients of the covenant, and any Jew can be a part of that covenant. If you're a Jew, I invite you to partake in this covenant, to learn more about your heritage, to learn more about our God, to learn more about how to correctly perform His commandments. I would love to welcome you home.